She had one carpet bag, one letter folded so many times the creases had gone soft. And the kind of quiet that only comes from a woman who has already made up her mind before anyone else in the room figured out there was a decision to be made. He told her the house was on fire, not literally, not anymore, but the ceiling of his bedroom had split open like a wound, and ash still floated down on dry mornings like something the house was trying to confess. He told her she should go back, that any reasonable woman would. She looked at him the way you look at someone who has just said something embarrassing. Then she picked up her bag and walked past him through the front door. If you've ever stood at the edge of something you weren't sure you could survive, a marriage, a winter, a life that didn't go the way you planned, then you already know exactly what this story is about. And if you haven't yet, stay with me, because what happened next in Red Hollow, Kansas, in spring of 1883, will make you ask yourself a question you may not be ready to answer. What would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one find their way into your heart, do us the kindness of hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications so you never miss what comes next. We put our whole selves into every story on this channel, and we'd love to know how far this one travels. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It means more than you know to see where our stories reach. And if this one moves you, leave a like. It tells us to keep going. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Gideon Rourke had not planned for any of this. He had planned, in the methodical way that men who live alone too long develop, for nearly everything else. He planned his planting by the almanac and by the feel of the soil under his boot. He planned his cattle drives by the price of beef in Wichita and the temperament of the sky. He planned his mornings before he opened his eyes, and he planned his evenings before the sun went down, because in Kansas in 1883, a man who didn't plan tended to lose things: cattle to disease, crops to drought, fingers to careless machinery. He had planned for winter. He had planned for drought. He had planned in a way he never spoke aloud but which lived in the back of every decision he made, for abandonment. What he had not planned for was a chimney fire in March. It started, the way most disasters do, with something small being ignored just a day too long. A crack in the flue that had been on his mental list for 2 winters. A dry spell that turned the interior of the chimney to kindling. A night when the wind came out of the northwest at exactly the wrong angle. He woke to the smell of smoke and a sound like the house clearing its throat. By the time he got the fire out, a section of his bedroom ceiling had collapsed onto the floor in a heap of charred burr and plaster dust. He stood in the middle of the wreckage at 2 in the morning, holding a lantern, and the first coherent thought that came to him was not about the repair cost. It was not about the cold air now pouring through the hole above him. It was about the letter he had written to Miss Mara Bellamy of Caldwell, Missouri, 3 months earlier. The letter that had led to 6 more letters. The letter that had eventually led to a formal agreement, train tickets, and a date in April when a woman he had never met was scheduled to step off a train in Red Hollow and presumably begin her life as his wife. He stood in the ash and the cold and thought, I have to tell her not to come. He sat down at his kitchen table at 3 in the morning and wrote the most careful, embarrassed letter of his life. He explained the fire. He described the damage honestly, perhaps more honestly than was strictly necessary, because he had long ago developed a habit of volunteering bad news before it could ambush him. He told her the house was in no condition to receive a woman. He told her he fully understood if she wished to reconsider, and that he would bear no ill feeling whatsoever. He posted it the next morning. He did not know until later that it arrived 2 days after she had already left. The train from Missouri came into Red Hollow at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, and Gideon was standing on the platform in his good shirt, the one he kept folded, in the cedar chest with his hat in his hands and a speech half prepared in his head. He had rehearsed various versions of it on the ride into town. Apologetic but not groveling, honest but not alarming. He would explain the situation clearly. He would offer to pay for her return ticket. He would make sure she understood that none of this was her fault. He was so focused on what he was going to say that he almost didn't notice what she looked like when she stepped off the train. She was not what he expected. He wasn't entirely sure what he had expected. The letters had described a woman of 34, former bookkeeper, raised by a carpenter father. No living family to speak of, but whatever image his mind had assembled from those facts dissolved the moment he saw her. She was not small, and she was not uncertain. She moved like someone who had been places before and wasn't particularly intimidated by this one. She carried a single carpet bag that looked like it had traveled before. She was wearing a gray dress and a look on her face that could have meant anything. She spotted him immediately. He wasn't hard to find. He was the only man on the platform holding his hat like an apology. She walked over without hesitation and said, "Mr. Rourke." It was not a question. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "there's something I need to explain to you." "All right," she said. He explained it. He had rehearsed, but the rehearsal disappeared on him. And what came out instead was just the plain truth: the chimney fire, the ceiling, the timing of the letter that had missed her, the fact that his bedroom was currently uninhabitable and that a portion of the roof was open to weather, and that he was genuinely, deeply sorry for the situation. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Her expression didn't shift much, which he found either reassuring or alarming. He couldn't decide which. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is the kitchen standing?" He blinked. "Yes." "Is there some sort of sleep that isn't the damaged room?" "There's a yes. The front room has a cot." She picked up her carpet bag. "Then the house is standing," she said. "Show me where to put this." He stared at her. "Mr. Rourke," she said with the patience of someone who was going to say this, "exactly once. I did travel 4 days by train to turn around at the platform because of a ceiling. I am aware that frontier life involves problems. I expected problems. A chimney fire is a problem. It is not a reason." He opened his mouth. "Closed it. You mentioned a hotel," she said. Yes. "I thought if you wanted to." "I don't want to stay in a hotel," she said. "I came here to see what I was walking into, and I'd prefer to walk into it sooner rather than later." There was a long moment where Gideon Rourke, a man who had managed cattle and drought and plains winters and the particular loneliness of a life built too much on work and not enough on trust, had absolutely no idea what to say. He reached for her carpet bag. She didn't let him take it. "I've got it," she said. They rode out to the ranch in near silence, which suited Gideon better than conversation would have. He had not been good at conversation in some years. He had become, without really deciding to, a man who said necessary things and left the rest alone. His neighbors thought him steady. His ranch hand, a 16-year-old named Clem, who showed up 3 days a week and asked few questions, thought him fair. The people in town who had known him before Lenora, before the winter that broke everything, sometimes looked at him with a particular expression he'd gotten good at not noticing. Mara Bellamy sat beside him on the wagon bench and looked at the land. He watched her looking at it in brief sideways glances, trying to read what she made of it. Kansas in April was not its most flattering month. The grass was not yet green, the sky was the color of tin, and the wind came across the flat ground with nothing to stop it. He had seen people arrive from the east and go pale at the sheer emptiness of it, the way the horizon just kept going, uninterrupted, until it seemed less like a landscape and more like a fact about the world. "It's flat," she said. "Yes, the letters described it as flat." I tried to be accurate. She nodded slowly. "You were." Another mile of silence. Then she said, "How long have you been here?" 11 years, he said. Came out in 72. Had 40 acres then. The rest came over time. "You built the house yourself?" "Most of it. A neighbor helped with the roof framing." "Your father didn't come?" Something tightened in his chest. "No, he passed before I came west. It was just me." She looked at him then, briefly, and he got the sense that she was filing this information somewhere not to use against him, just to keep. Like someone who understood that knowing the architecture of a person required knowing what they had built alone. "The carpentry is good," she said when the ranch house came into view. She was looking at it with an evaluating eye, not a critical one. "Whoever did the corner joints on the front porch knew what they were doing. My father," he said, "taught me before he died." She was quiet for a moment. "Then mine too." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He sat there for a moment, hat in his hands again, not entirely sure what was supposed to happen next. He had imagined this arrival probably 100 times over the past 3 months. Not one of those imaginations had included a woman who asked about corner joints. Well, he said, here it is. Mara Bellamy looked at the house. At the front porch he'd rebuilt twice. At the barn that was more organized than most men's kitchens. At the fields that were not yet planted, but that held the particular quality of land that has been looked after, no volunteer weeds gone to seed, fences tight, ground turned properly the fall before. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help. Walked up to the front door, put her hand on the frame just briefly, fingers reading the wood, and then pushed it open and went inside. Gideon sat on the wagon for a moment in the cold April wind, listening to the sound of her boots on his floorboards. He had not heard that sound in years. He wasn't entirely sure how he felt about hearing it again. There was something that might have been relief, and something that might have been the opposite of relief, a sharp, particular awareness that something had changed, and that there was no going back to the version of the morning that existed before that train arrived. He climbed down from the wagon. He followed her inside. The damaged ceiling was worse in daylight. He had gotten somewhat used to it over the past 3 weeks, the way you can get used to almost anything if you live with it long enough. But watching Mara Bellamy look up at the collapsed section of his bedroom ceiling, the split timbers, the hole where the plaster had given way, the daylight coming through in 2 places, he saw it fresh through her eyes and felt acutely what an embarrassing thing it was to have invited a woman into. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at it for a long time. The chimney's the source, she said, flew crack. Should have caught it 2 years ago. She nodded. The framing above, is it structurally sound on the other side of the damage? He looked at her. You know about framing? My father built houses, she said. I handed him boards and held things level for 15 years. I don't know everything, but I know enough to ask the right questions. She looked up at the hole again. Is it sound? Yes. The damage stopped short of the main beam. Then it's a repair, not a reconstruction, she said. That's workable. He waited for the rest, the hesitation, the recalculation, the careful phrasing of a woman deciding she'd made a mistake. He had been waiting for it since the platform. He was certain it was coming. Instead, she turned to him and said, Do you have timber for it already? Or do you need to order it? I have timber, he said slowly, in the barn. Good. She set her carpet bag down just outside the bedroom door. Show me the kitchen. He showed her the kitchen. She opened every cupboard. She looked at the stove, checked the condition of the firebox, tested the damper. She examined the window frame that had been letting a draft in. Since November, ran her finger along the sill, pressed gently at the corner where the wood was beginning to soften. This'll rot through by fall if it's not addressed, she said, not accusingly. Just as a fact, I know, he said, it's on my list. How long has it been on your list? He almost smiled. Since November. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not judgment, something closer to recognition. Like she understood exactly how a thing stayed on a list. I used to keep a list, she said, after my father died and I was managing the house alone. Things would sit on it for months because there was only one of me, and some repairs required 2 pairs of hands. He hadn't thought about that. He had just assumed she'd kept a clean house because she seemed like the kind of woman who kept a clean house. What did you do? He asked. About the things that needed 2 pairs of hands. Mostly I waited, she said. Sometimes I figured out a way to do them alone. It's slower, but it works if you're patient enough. She closed the last cupboard. It's easier with 2. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the Kansas wind pushed against the house the way it always did, testing the seams. Miss Bellamy, Gideon said. He stopped, started again. You don't have to pretend this is what you expected. She looked at him, directly the way she had at the platform. I'm not pretending anything, she said. I expected it to be hard. This is hard. That's not a surprise, Mr. Rourke. That's just what I came for. He didn't know what to do with that. He had spent so much of the past years braced for the moment when someone looked at the gap between what he had to offer and what a person reasonably deserved and decided the gap was too wide. He had made the gap smaller where he could. He kept the ranch in order. He kept his word. He kept his distances. He had arranged everything around the assumption that eventually, inevitably, The calculation wouldn't work out in his favor. Mara Bellamy was looking at him like the calculation hadn't even occurred to her. "All right," he said finally. "The cot in the front room is clean. I'll put your bag there. Thank you." He picked up the carpet bag she let him this time and carried it to the front room. She went to the window and looked out at the barn. "Your cattle look healthy," she said. "They are. Your barn is organized. I try to keep it that way." She turned from the window. "You've been managing this alone for how long?" He thought about whether to answer honestly. "A while," he said. "Several years." She waited. She had that quality, the kind of patience that doesn't push, just open space. "My wife left," he said, "in the winter of '78. The plains didn't suit her. She went back east." He said it the way he always said it, with the particular flatness of a sentence that has been spoken enough times to lose its shape. "I've been alone since." Mara Bellamy looked at him for a long moment. Not with pity, not with the careful sympathy of someone who didn't know what to say, with something more like understanding the kind you only get from having carried your own version of a similar weight. "I see," she said quietly, and then, because she understood something about how a man like Gideon Rourke was put together, she didn't say anything else about it. She just looked back out at the barn. "The cattle look healthy," she said again. "That counts for a lot." That night, Gideon made dinner. It was not a good dinner. He cooked the way. He cooked everything efficiently, without ceremony, with the primary goal of producing something edible before the day was fully gone. Salt pork and beans and cornbread that was slightly overdone on the bottom because he'd been distracted by a broken hinge on the barn gate that he kept meaning to replace. Mara ate what he put in front of her without comment. When she finished, she stood up and began clearing the dishes without being asked. He started to object on instinct. She gave him a look. He sat back down. She washed the dishes. He watched her, unsure what else to do. The kitchen felt different with another person moving through it. Smaller, maybe, or possibly larger. He couldn't decide which. "You'll want to see the accounts tomorrow," he said. It came out wrong, too abrupt, like an assignment. She didn't seem to notice. "Yes," she said, "after the ceiling." He blinked. "What?" "After we start on the ceiling," she said. "I want to get at least an assessment done in the morning, while the light is good. Then the accounts in the afternoon." He stared at her back for a moment. "You want to start on the ceiling tomorrow? Is there a reason to wait?" He thought about several things he could say. None of them came out. "No," he said, "I suppose not." She set the last dish on the drying rack, dried her hands on a cloth, and turned around. In the lamplight, she looked tired, the particular exhaustion of 4 days of travel finally catching up, but her eyes were still clear and direct. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I know this is unusual. I know you didn't plan for it to go like this. I know you're wondering whether you made a mistake." She paused. "I want you to know that I'm wondering the same thing about myself. That's normal. What I'm not wondering is whether I'm capable of being here. I've been capable of harder things than a broken ceiling and an awkward first evening." He looked at her. "So let's just take it one day at a time," she said. "Start with the ceiling. See what we're working with." There was no grand gesture in it, no declaration. It was in its way the most practical thing anyone had said to him in years. "All right," he said. "Good night, Mr. Rourke." "Good night, Miss Bellamy." She took the lamp he offered her and went to the front room. Gideon sat alone in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the wind move across his property. The same wind he'd listened to alone for 5 years. The same prairie silence. But the house didn't feel quite the same. He wasn't sure, sitting there in the dark, whether that was a good thing or a dangerous one. He suspected, in the way you suspect something before you're ready to admit it, that it might be both. He woke before she did, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was to find the kitchen already warm. The stove had been fed. Not stoked to a roar, just fed enough to take the edge off the morning cold, the way someone does it who understands that a fire doesn't need to be dramatic to do its job. The coffee pot was sitting on the back burner, not yet boiling, just beginning to think about it. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his socks and looked at the stove for a long moment, and then he looked toward the front room, where the door was still closed. He hadn't heard her get up. He was a light sleeper. Had been since Lenora left, when the silence of the house started feeling less like peace, and more like a thing that needed to be monitored. He slept with one ear open the way men do who have learned that the night has its own kind of trouble. And still he hadn't heard her. He poured himself a cup of coffee that wasn't quite done brewing, which meant the first swallow was weak and slightly gritty, and he drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at a sky that had gone gray and flat overnight. The kind of sky that didn't promise anything in particular. Kansas specialized in that kind of sky. He heard her door open. Her footsteps, he was already learning the sound of them, which was strange to notice, came down the short hall and into the kitchen. She was dressed. Her hair was pinned up the way it had been the day before. She was carrying a small notebook that he hadn't seen yesterday, and she looked like she'd been awake for a while. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He held up the pot. "Coffee's weak." "That's all right." She poured herself a cup and stood beside him at the window. Not close, there was a careful foot of distance between them, the distance of two people who understand they're strangers and are being respectful about it. She looked at the sky. Rain, maybe by afternoon. "More likely tomorrow." She nodded. "We should get up on that roof this morning then." He turned his head and looked at her. "You're not going up on the roof." She looked back at him with an expression that was not hostile but was absolutely final. "Mr. Rourke, my father built houses. I have been on more roofs than you have likely had occasion to visit. I'm not suggesting I do the heavy work. I'm suggesting that one person assessing damage while another person holds the ladder and passes things up is significantly more efficient than one person doing it alone." She looked back out the window. "Unless you'd prefer to climb up there by yourself and try to hold the measuring line with your teeth." He opened his mouth, closed it. "Fine," he said. She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before it disappeared. They finished the coffee and ate the eggs he scrambled. He was marginally better at eggs than at salt pork, though not by much, and then they went out to the barn to get the ladder. Clem was already there. Clem was 16 and had the particular quality of teenage boys who have grown up around working land, which meant he was simultaneously capable of things most grown men in cities couldn't manage and completely unprepared for anything that fell outside his established understanding of how the world operated. He was forking hay into the cattle stall when they came in, and he stopped mid-fork when he saw Mara, and for a moment he just stood there with hay falling off the tines. "Clem," Gideon said, "this is Miss Bellamy. She'll be staying on." Clem stared. He was not subtle about it. "You're the mail order." He stopped himself, possibly because even at 16, you could read Gideon Rourke's face well enough to know when to reverse course. It's good to meet you, ma'am." "You too," Mara said. She looked at the hay situation he'd been working on, then looked at the cattle. That second one near the water trough, she's favoring her front left. Clem looked at the cow in question, then back at Mara. "Since yesterday," he said, cautiously, like he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or suspicious. "Mr. Rourke was going to look at the hoof this morning." "I'll look at it," Gideon said. He was already moving toward the stall. "After we get the ladder sorted." "I can get the ladder," Clem said immediately, with the energy of a boy who has just found a task that requires no further social navigation. He practically threw himself at the back wall where the ladder was leaned. Mara watched him go with an expression that was almost fond. "He's a good worker," she said quietly to Gideon. "When he's not distracted," Gideon said. "Which is most of the time, but yes, he's a good kid." They got the ladder to the house. Gideon went up first, which she allowed, he suspected, because she understood there were some battles not worth fighting on the first morning. He pulled himself up onto the roof section above the bedroom and found what he expected to find. The damaged area was worse from above than from below, the way most things are when you see their underside. The chimney itself was the problem. The crack he'd been meaning to address had widened over the winter, and water had gotten into the space between the chimney and the roof framing, and from there it had been a matter of time. He called down what he was seeing. Mara, standing at the base of the ladder with her notebook open, wrote it down. She asked specific questions: the width of the crack, the extent of the rot in the surrounding framing, whether the chimney cap was intact. She asked them in the order that made structural sense, which told him she wasn't just taking notes for the sake of having notes. She was building a picture. "The cap's cracked," he called down. I thought it was just settled wrong. It's actually cracked through. That's probably where the fire started, she called back. Water got under a cracked cap, froze, expanded the crack, gave the heat somewhere to go that it shouldn't. A pause. Your father teach you to lay the chimney, or did you hire that out? The question caught him slightly off guard. Hired it. A man named Pritchard. He's gone now, moved to Colorado. Not blaming anyone, she said, just understanding the history. He came back down after 20 minutes. She showed him what she'd written. It was not a list, it was more like a diagram in words, each problem connected to its source and its consequence, the repair sequence laid out in an order that minimized redundant effort. He read it twice. You did this from what I called down, he said. My father used to send me up to take measurements, she said. I learned to listen for what mattered and skip what didn't. She tapped the page. If we address the chimney cap first, then reset the flashing, then come at the ceiling from above before we patch from below, we save ourselves tearing out work twice. But it depends on whether you have cap material already or need to order it. Gideon looked at the diagram in words. He thought about the approach he'd been planning, which was, in honest retrospect, the approach of a man working alone who had defaulted to doing things in the order they occurred to him, rather than the order that made the most sense. I have cap material, he said, in the barn loft. Left over from the spring house. Good, she said. Then we can start this afternoon. He looked at her. Yes, she said simply. There was no dramatic pause after that. She just closed the notebook and went back inside to start making sense of the kitchen stores while he stood on the ground outside his own house, holding the ladder, and tried to work out how a woman he'd known for less than 18 hours had quietly and efficiently reorganized the next 4 days of his life in a way that was, he had to admit, considerably more logical than what he'd had in mind. He carried the ladder back to the barn. He didn't examine the feeling too closely. The hoof turned out to be a small stone lodged under the frog, nothing serious, out in 30 seconds with a pick, the kind of thing that becomes a serious problem only if you leave it. He pulled it out, checked the area for any sign of infection, found none, and let the cow move back to the water trough. She walked normally immediately, which meant the issue was genuinely minor, and not something that had been going on longer than yesterday. He stood in the barn and made a note in his head about the cow. Then he thought about the fact that Mara had spotted it from 15 feet away in a dim barn after less than a minute on the property. He didn't know what to do with that either. So he filed it alongside the coffee and the notebook, and the diagram in words, and the question about corner joints, in the growing collection of things about Mara Bellamy that he was accumulating faster than he knew how to sort. He went back to the house. She was at the kitchen table with his ledger open. He had left the ledger on the shelf beside the kitchen door, where it lived, where it had always lived, where he could reach for it without having to think about where it was. It was not a private document, it was just the ranch accounts, expenses and income and debt and credit, nothing he was ashamed of, but seeing her sitting at his table with it open in front of her produced a strange sensation he hadn't anticipated. Like someone had walked into a room he'd been keeping tidy for himself and started rearranging the furniture. Not maliciously, just rearranging it. I should have asked, she said without looking up. She had apparently developed some ability to read the quality of his silence from across the room. I saw it on the shelf, and I should have asked first. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. It's fine, he said, and then, because it was true, I was going to show it to you this afternoon. She looked up. Your feed costs in January are 20% higher than December, but your herd count didn't change. She said it neutrally, not accusingly. Did prices go up, or did you change suppliers? He thought about it. Prices went up. Lundquist raised his by a quarter in January. He said feed corn was short, was it? He said it was. Did you check with anyone else? The question sat in the air between them. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. I've bought from Lundquist for 8 years. I didn't think to. She nodded slowly. She wasn't pressing it. She was just noting it, the way she noted everything, adding it to whatever picture she was constructing in that precise mind of hers. His competitor in Harrington, do you know if they sell the same grade? I know they sell feed. I don't know what grade. It might be worth finding out, she said. not insisting, just offering. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the table. In the morning light, she looked tired in a way she probably didn't know. She looked the shadows under her eyes from 4 days of travel hadn't fully lifted. And there was a tension around her jaw that appeared when she was concentrating hard, a tension she wasn't controlling the way she controlled everything else. She was running on something beyond ordinary energy. He'd seen it in men who'd pushed past their limits and were operating on will alone. "How long were you up this morning?" he said. She glanced at him. "A while." "How long is a while?" She hesitated. "Since 4. He looked at the window. "It was 8:30. You were awake at 4 in the morning in a strange house, and you—" He stopped. "Why?" She looked down at the ledger. Something shifted in her posture, a small thing, barely visible, but he was beginning to notice small things about her with an attention he hadn't given to another person in years. "I don't sleep well in new places," she said. "I never have. When I was a child, every time my father took a new job in a new town, I'd lie awake the whole first night listening to the house." She paused, trying to learn the sounds of it. What was the house settling, and what was something else? "And last night," she looked up. "Last night I was learning the sounds of your house," she said. It was a simple answer. It was also not a simple answer at all. He sat with it for a moment. "Did you learn them?" he asked. "Mostly," she said. "Your north wall pops twice between midnight and 2. The front room floorboard near the window third board from the wall gives when the temperature drops. The well pump handle rattles loose when the wind comes from the east." She looked back at the ledger. "You have good bones, Mr. Rourke. This house is built to last. The problems you have are maintenance problems, things left too long on that list." He thought about November and the kitchen windowsill and how long a list could get when you were only one person. "I know," he said. "I'm not criticizing," she said quietly. "I know that too." She turned a page in the ledger. He watched her read. She read the way she did everything, not fast, but nothing wasted. No backtracking, no hesitation. Like her eyes found the thing that mattered and went directly to it, skipping the noise. "Your wheat revenue last year was strong," she said. "Best in 3 years. What do you attribute that to?" "Good season. Rain when it needed to come. I planted 2 weeks earlier than I had been a neighbor's recommendation. It made a difference." She nodded. "Are you planting the same acreage this year?" "Was planning to." "You have room for more?" She said it carefully, not like a challenge, like someone who had already looked at the numbers and was approaching the question from the answer's direction. "The east field's been fallow 2 years," he said. "I could break it. It'd take some work. What's stopping you?" He thought about it, actually thought about it, not the automatic answer he'd been giving himself, which was that he hadn't gotten around to it. "Time," he said. "It's a 2-person job, really, breaking ground that sat that long. I've been managing alone and He stopped. She was looking at him. "There are 2 of us now," she said. Again, simple. Again, not simple at all. He looked at the table. "Yes," he said. The thing was, and this was the part Gideon Rourke had not anticipated, not in any of the 100-odd versions of this morning, he had imagined over the past 3 months the thing was that she was right. Not about everything. She couldn't be right about everything because she'd been here less than a day and she was working from information that was still incomplete. But she was right about enough of it, and in a way that was useful rather than theoretical, that he found himself in the unfamiliar position of revising assumptions he'd held for years. He had spent 5 years building a ranch that was solvent. That was the goal he'd permitted himself, post-Lenora. Solvent, not thriving, not exceptional, solvent and quiet and sustained by his own 2 hands, which could not be taken from him when someone left. Mara Bellamy was sitting across from him, reading his numbers and asking why solvent was the ceiling. He didn't have an answer for that didn't involve Lenora, and he was not ready for that conversation. "We should start on the chimney cap this afternoon," he said. She accepted the redirect without comment. "What do we need from the barn loft?" "The cap material and the flashing lead. There's a tin box up there, gray bent corner on the lid. That has the ceiling compound. I'll get it." "I'll get it," he said on reflex. She looked at him, the same look she'd given him at the train platform when he'd reached for her bag. "Mr. Rourke, I am going to get things from barn lofts." I am going to go up on roofs. I am going to read your ledger and walk your fields and handle your cattle when handling is needed. If you spend the next year trying to prevent me from doing any of those things, you will exhaust yourself and it will not stop me. She said it without heat. Completely level. I am not fragile. Please stop treating me as if I might be. He looked at her for a long moment. My first wife, he said. Before he decided to say it, couldn't handle the physical work. She wasn't built for it, and I should have seen that earlier than I did. I got into the habit of, he stopped, of managing everything, Mara said, not unkindly. Yes, I'm not her, Mara said. I know that. Do you? He thought about it, actually thought about it, instead of the automatic yes that had been forming. I'm working on it, he said. Something in her face shifted just slightly, just enough. That's an honest answer, she said. She stood up and went to get the materials from the barn loft herself. He sat at the table and listened to her boots going across the yard and thought about 5 years of decisions made in the specific absence of someone and what it might take to unlearn the shape of that absence. It was the kind of thinking that could spiral if you let it. He didn't let it. He got up and went to start mixing the ceiling compound. The chimney cap repair took most of the afternoon. It was neither graceful nor efficient chimney work, never is, especially on an older chimney with a history of patched repairs that created their own complications. The original cap had been set with a lime mortar that had gone brittle and was coming away in sections, and before they could fit the new cap they had to chip away the old compound down to stable material, which meant Gideon on the roof with a chisel, and Mara below passing things up and writing notes he asked for, and occasionally calling corrections when she could see from below that he was working towards something that wasn't going to hold. She was right about the chimney cap starting the fire. When he got the old cap fully off, he could see exactly where the original crack had been, and how water had gotten in over multiple seasons, and how the freeze and thaw had done its work over years, and how the morning of the fire had probably been the end of a process that had started the winter. He'd been too busy to get up there and look. You could have caught this 2 years ago, she called up. Not cruelly, just factually. I know, he called back. What stopped you? He positioned the new cap time. And I didn't like heights as much when I was younger. A pause from below. You don't like heights? I said as much. I've improved. Another pause. Then from below, the clear sound of her laughing. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. It was not what he'd expected. It was shorter and less careful than the rest of her. A real laugh that had clearly gotten out before she'd had a chance to decide whether to let it. He found himself on the roof, fitting a chimney cap, smiling at the sound of it. He wiped the smile off before he came down. She had already composed herself by the time he reached the ladder. But there was still something lighter in her face than there had been that morning, a loosening, barely perceptible, in the careful control she maintained over her own expression, like something had relaxed 1 degree. The cap seated, he said. I could see from here. It looks level. Plumb line tomorrow to check. She nodded. She made a note. She looked at the house in the long, late afternoon light, and he noticed her doing what she'd done in the barn that morning, that particular way she had of looking at something that wasn't just seeing it, that was assessing it, learning it, filing it away. The siding on the north face, she said. 3rd board down, 2nd section from the east corner. There's a gap. He looked. Where? You have to stand about 2 feet left of where you're standing. He moved. He looked. There it was, a gap he'd walked past 100 times without noticing, because from the angle he usually approached the house it was invisible. I'll be damned, he said. Water gets in there, she said. Over winters. That's how you end up with rot. He looked at the gap. He looked at her. How did you see that from this angle? Light's coming from the west, she said. The gap throws a shadow in the late afternoon that you can't see at any other time of day. She put her notebook away. My father taught me that. He said most problems in a building are there all the time, you just need to learn how to look for them. Gideon looked at the gap for another moment. Then he looked at Mara Bellamy standing in his yard in the late Kansas afternoon, her hair coming slightly loose from its pins, a smudge of chimney soot on the back of her right hand that she either hadn't noticed or had decided wasn't worth addressing, her notebook closed and tucked under her arm. looking at his house with the eyes of someone who was learning it the way you learn something you intend to keep. Something in his chest moved that he had not given permission to move. He looked away. "I'll mark it," he said. "We can address it after the ceiling's done." "That's the right order," she said. They went inside. He cooked again that evening, and again it was not a good meal, and again she ate it without complaint and cleared up after. But the kitchen felt different than it had the night before, not dramatically different, not the kind of different you'd put into words, just the specific difference between a space in its first day of being changed and the same space a day later, when the change had had time to settle in and stop feeling so foreign. After dinner, she opened the notebook again at the kitchen table and made additional notes while he worked on the cracked window frame he'd been putting off since November. He had the tools out and the glazing compound ready before he realized he'd just started doing it, not because he'd planned to, but because at some point in the afternoon, the window frame had moved from the list in his head to a thing he was actually going to address tonight. He wasn't sure if that was her influence, or just the natural momentum of a day spent working rather than planning to work. He didn't examine it too closely. She looked up once when the scraping of the old glazing got loud. "That window's been on your list since November," she said. "Yes. What changed tonight?" He thought about it. "I had a second person to notice it with," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her notes. "That's worth something," she said. The next morning she was up at 4 again. He found the stove fed and the coffee started. He stood in the kitchen and decided not to say anything about it, not the hours she was keeping, not the fact that she was clearly running on less sleep than she needed, not the fact that it was beginning to worry him in a way he did not have the right to worry about her yet. He poured his coffee and stood at the window and waited. She came out at 5:30, and this time she looked like the sleep deprivation had caught up somewhat. She moved with slightly less precision, and she held her coffee with both hands the way people do when they need the warmth more than the caffeine. She sat down at the table and was quiet for longer than usual. "Bad night," he said after a while. "The north wall popped 3 times, she said. "It threw off my count." He looked at her over his cup. "You're counting the sounds. Old habit. If I know how many times something happens and when, it stops startling me." She wrapped her hands tighter around her cup. "I know it sounds strange. It sounds like something a person does when they've had to figure out how to feel safe in a lot of different places," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "My father took contracts wherever they came," she said. "New town every year or 2, sometimes more. I went through a period when I was young, 10, 11, where the moving felt like the world was telling me that nothing was supposed to stay." She looked at her coffee. "You either decide that's true or you decide it isn't." "Which did you decide?" "I decided it isn't." She looked up. "But it took until I was about 30 to fully believe it." He thought about that, about deciding something was true and then spending the years between the decision and the belief slowly convincing yourself. "I know something about that kind of deciding," he said. She looked at him, waiting in that way she had. He shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "I'll tell you. Just not yet." She nodded. She didn't push. He'd noticed that about her she never pushed. She just opened a space and let you decide whether to step into it. "All right," she said. They went to work on the ceiling. It took 4 days. 4 days of dust and splinters and awkward angles and the particular frustration of repair work that reveals additional problems as it goes the way the water damage had followed the framing 2 feet further than he'd thought. The way one of the joists had a soft spot that needed sistering, the way the plaster mix he'd made wasn't quite right the first time and had to be scraped back and started again. There was a morning when everything went wrong, the mix failed. Clem dropped the good saw off the loft and bent a tooth. The clouds came in fast, and they had to stop the roof work entirely and cover things with canvas, and Gideon sat on an upturned bucket in the half-repaired bedroom and stared at the mess and felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting his own house for 3 weeks. Mara sat down on an upturned crate across from him. They sat there in the dust and the half-dark for a moment. "It's worse before it's better," she said. "Always." "I know that," he said. "I know you know that. I'm just saying it out loud because sometimes it helps to hear it." He looked at her. Does it help? She thought about it. Sometimes, she said, not always, but it's worth trying. He looked at the ruined ceiling above them, at the canvas visible through the gap in the roof, already starting to bow with rainwater. At the bent joist he was going to have to address before he could close anything up. My first wife left in a winter, he said. It came out without planning, the way the truth sometimes does when you've run out of the energy it takes to hold it back. November, after the first bad storm, I came in from the cattle, and she was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her bag packed, and she said she couldn't do it. That she'd tried, but she couldn't. He looked at his hands. She was right. I knew she was wrong for this life before we married. I knew it, and I married her anyway, because I was lonely and 34, and I thought she'd come to love it the way I loved it. He was quiet for a moment. That was my failure, not hers. Mara didn't say anything. She listened. After she left, I spent a winter in this house alone that I don't think I can describe accurately, he said. And when it was over, I made a decision. I decided the ranch would be enough. That I'd build something here that didn't need anyone else to sustain it. He looked up at the damaged ceiling. I got good at it. Too good at it, maybe. And then you wrote a letter, Mara said. And then I wrote a letter. He looked at her. I'm still not sure what made me do it. I told myself I was done with the idea of I'd told myself it was simpler alone. What changed? He was quiet for a moment. The East Field, he said. 2 summers ago. I stood in it and I looked at what I'd built. And it was good the ranch was solvent and running well, and I'd done it. I'd done it all myself. And I thought, there is nobody to tell about this. He looked at his hands again. It was the loneliest moment of my life, and I'd been lonely for years. The rain was picking up outside. He could hear it on the canvas, a soft rushing sound. I wrote the letter 6 weeks later, he said. Mara sat across from him in the dust and the half-dark of his damaged bedroom, and she was quiet for a long moment. Not the silence of someone who didn't know what to say. The silence of someone who was giving a truth the space it deserved. I came west, she said finally, because I had built a life in Missouri that was orderly and sufficient and completely without the thing that makes orderly and sufficient worth having. She looked at him directly. I had my work. I had my routine. I had a clean house, and I knew where everything was. And there was nobody depending on me and nobody I was responsible to. And I was so lonely I used to count the number of conversations I had each week, just to prove to myself I was still a person other people talk to. She stopped. I was up to 4 on a good week. The rain came harder. So, she said, we're both doing something brave and slightly terrifying, and neither of us is certain it's going to work. That about covers it, he said. She stood up and dusted her hands on her work dress. Then we'd better fix the ceiling, she said, so we have something worth finding out. He stood up too. They went back to work. By the 4th day, the ceiling was closed. Not finished, it needed final plastering and painting, and the chimney work above it still needed ceiling compound to fully cure but closed. Structurally sound, weather-tight, the kind of repair that had been done right instead of done fast, which meant it wouldn't need doing again for a long time. Gideon stood in the repaired bedroom on the afternoon of the 4th day and looked at the ceiling. He looked at the neat lines of new plaster, the fresh framing visible only if you knew exactly where to look, the section of siding on the north face that Mara had spotted in the late afternoon light and that they'd addressed on the 3rd day, packed and sealed, before the rain got into it. He thought about the weeks he'd spent looking at the damage and dreading the repair. He thought about the fact that it had taken 4 days. Mara came and stood beside him, closer than the careful foot she'd maintained at the beginning. He didn't think she was aware of it. It had happened gradually, the way distance does. Not through decision, but through the accumulated gravity of days spent working alongside someone until the space between you narrows naturally and you don't notice, until it already has. She looked at the ceiling. Good bones, she said. You keep saying that because it keeps being true. He turned his head and looked at her. 4 days of work had done something to her face. Some of the held qualities she'd arrived with had loosened. She still held herself with the same self-possession, the same precision, but the edges of it were warmer now. Like the house's sounds, she had learned them enough that they had stopped startling her. Miss Bellamy, he said. She looked at him. He tried to find the words for something he was not practiced at saying. Thank you, he said. For he gestured at the ceiling, at the room, and then because the gesture wasn't enough, he said, for staying. She held his gaze for a moment. I told you at the platform, she said. The house wasn't a reason. I know. But I wasn't certain you'd still feel that way. 4 days in with plastered dust in your hair and a bent joist and rain coming through the canvas. My hair was fine, she said. He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. The late afternoon light came through the repaired window and lay flat across the freshly plastered ceiling, and Gideon Rourke stood in the room he had slept alone in for 5 years and felt something shift that he didn't have a name for yet. Not joy exactly, something more cautious than joy. Something that had to do with a door that had been closed for a long time coming slightly open, and the specific, quiet terror of not knowing yet what was on the other side. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had made one large mistake by rushing towards something he wanted, that this was not the moment to rush. But he stopped bracing for the door to close. That was something. It was more than he'd managed in 5 years. Outside, the Kansas afternoon went on as it always did, broad and indifferent, full of weather coming in from the west, the cattle in the lower field, the east field unbroken and waiting, the well pump rattling in the east wind. Everything the same as it had been. Everything completely different than it had been. Mara turned away from the ceiling and went to make notes about the feed supply. Gideon went to check on the cattle. They moved through the late afternoon in their separate tasks, and the house held them both. And neither of them said what they were both beginning, carefully, to think. The east field broke harder than either of them expected. Gideon had known it would be work 2 years. Fallow meant the ground had gone back to something approaching its original stubbornness, the root systems of volunteer grass and thistle threading themselves through the soil and the patient, in different way that land reclaims itself when you stop paying attention. He'd broken ground before. He knew what it asked of a person. But knowing a thing in your head and meeting it with your body on a cold May morning are 2 different conversations entirely. The first morning, they lost 2 hours to a section of ground that had a layer of hard clay pan 6 inches down, not deep enough to avoid, not shallow enough to deal with quickly. The braking plow hit it and bounced, and Gideon had to readjust the blade depth twice before they found the angle that worked. And by the time they had it right, the horse was already lathered, and the morning light had gone from cool blue to hard white. Mara worked the second line. She had never driven a braking plow, but she had watched him for 40 minutes before she asked to try, and when she asked, she did it the way she asked everything directly, without apology, giving him the information she had and letting him decide. He'd shown her the grip, the angle of the body, what to feel for in the resistance. She'd listened with the concentrated stillness she brought to anything she was learning. Then she'd taken the handles and started working. She was not good at it. Not yet. She fought the plow more than she should have for the first half hour, her arms too tense, trying to control something that needed to be guided rather than gripped. Twice she lost the angle and the blade skipped sideways into unbroken ground. The second time she stopped, stood in the furrow, and swore under her breath with an inventiveness that surprised him. He didn't say anything. He just watched her reset her stance and start again. By mid-morning, she'd found something closer to the rhythm of it. Not smooth, it would never be smooth until she'd done it enough times to stop thinking about the mechanics, but functional. Effective. She was leaving behind her a furrow that was uneven in places but of usable depth, and she was learning as she went in the manner of someone who treats failure as information rather than verdict. He brought the horse water at noon. He brought her water too, and she drank it standing in the field without coming to the fence, because she was in the middle of a line and apparently did not consider a line something you left unfinished. Take a break, he said. I'll finish the line, she said. The line will be there. So will I, she said, and kept walking. He watched her go to the end of the furrow, stop, turn the horse, and start back. He noticed that her second pass was measurably better than her first. He thought about the window frame in November, about the ledger in January, about all the things that had stayed on his list, because doing them alone had made them feel too large. He thought about the east field the summer 2 years ago, when he'd stood in the finished field with no one to tell. He drank his water and went back to his own line. By the end of the first week, the east field was half broken. By the end of the second, it was done. It was not the fastest breaking Gideon had managed in his years on this land, and it was not the cleanest. There were places where Mara's still developing technique had left the furrows slightly irregular, and there was one section near the eastern fence where a buried rock had stopped them for an entire afternoon and had to be dug out with manual labor before they could proceed. But it was done. The field lay open and dark in the late May light, ready for seed, and Gideon stood at the edge of it on the evening of the day they finished and looked at what two people had done in 2 weeks that he had been telling himself for 2 years was beyond a single person's reach. Mara came to stand beside him. "You could have had this field 2 years ago," she said. "I know. Why didn't you hire help?" He thought about the honest answer. "Because hired help leaves," he said, "when the job's done or when something better comes along or when the winter gets hard enough." He looked at the broken ground. "I got to where I'd rather do less with certainty than more with something I couldn't count on." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a very efficient way to stay smaller than you should be," she said. It wasn't cruel, but it landed squarely, the way things do when they're true, and you've known them and not said them. "Yes," he said. They stood there while the evening light worked its way across the field, that particular Kansas gold that came in low in late May and made even broken ground look like something worth having. Gideon was aware of her beside him in the specific way he'd been aware of her for the past 3 weeks, not constantly, not dramatically, but with a steady low-level attention that had crept up on him, so gradually he hadn't noticed until it was already established. He knew the sound of her footsteps on the floorboards now. He knew which side of the table she preferred. He knew she drank her coffee fast and her evening tea slow. He knew she got a particular set to her jaw when she was working through a problem she hadn't solved yet, and a different set when she was angry and had decided not to say so. He knew more about her in 3 weeks than he had known about some people he'd spent years alongside. He wasn't certain what to do with that knowledge. He kept it the way he kept other things he wasn't ready to act on carefully, and in a part of himself he didn't examine too often. "The seed order," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll ride to town. I'll come." He started to say something about the house, about there being things to do, and then stopped, because the argument was reflexive and not genuine, and he'd been trying, imperfectly but genuinely trying, to stop making arguments that were really just the old habit of being alone talking. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "You were going to tell me to stay. I was going to consider it, and I reconsidered." She looked back at the field. "Good," she said. They rode into Red Hollow the next morning on a day that had decided to be warm ahead of schedule, the sky a clear and almost aggressive blue. Gideon had been to town alone for 11 years. He knew how he moved through it, efficient, minimal, the transactions he needed, and then the road back. He knew which people wanted to talk and could be redirected with a nod and a walk, and which ones he owed actual conversation to, and he managed the whole thing with the choreography of a man who has organized his social life around keeping it short. He had not considered what riding into Red Hollow with a woman beside him would do to that choreography. The first person who saw them was Martha Ellison, who ran the dry goods with her husband and had approximately no filter between what she thought and what she said, a quality that made her either very easy or very difficult to deal with depending on the subject. She came out of the store onto the boardwalk, presumably for entirely unrelated reasons, and stopped when she saw them, and stared with the openness of someone who had simply decided that social convention did not apply to this particular moment. "Well," she said, "so she's real." Mara looked at the woman evenly. "Generally, yes," she said. Martha Ellison laughed a big, genuine laugh that involved her whole face. "I like her," she said to Gideon. "She's got a mouth on her." "I have a vocabulary," Mara said, "which is slightly different." Martha laughed again. She looked at Gideon with an expression that mixed amusement with something more genuine, something that had to do. He suspected with the years she and her husband had watched him move through this town in his careful, contracted solitude. "You look different," she told him. "Same as always," he said. "That's what I would have said before," she said. "But apparently I was wrong about what same as always looked like." He didn't answer that. The seed merchant was a man named Aldous Ferris, who had been in the same location for 12 years, and who had the quality of a man whose business success had just barely kept pace with his self-regard. He was not dishonest. He was simply the kind of man who preferred conversations in which he held the most information, and who adjusted his pricing accordingly when he sensed that preference was being underestimated. He saw Gideon come in. He saw Mara come in behind him. He looked at her the way men looked at women they'd categorized before they'd assessed them. "This is Miss Bellamy," Gideon said. "She'll be discussing the order with me." Something flickered in Ferris's face, not quite surprise, not quite its opposite. "Of course," he said, pleasantly enough. He pulled out his order book. "Now, for the wheat seed, I've got the same variety we used last season." "What varieties do you have in total?" Mara said. Ferris looked at her. "Beg pardon? Wheat varieties. What do you carry? And what are the germination rates on each?" A small silence. "Well, there's the standard red winter, which is what most of the... and the alternatives," she said. She was not aggressive, just precise. The same precision she brought to the ledger, to the roof assessment, to the furrow lines. The precision of someone who had learned that vague answers were often a product of not wanting you to ask the next question. Ferris listed 3 varieties. She asked about disease resistance on each. She asked about the price differential. She asked about yield data from the previous 2 seasons, which he did not have on hand but was clearly not used to being asked for, and she noted the absence of that data in her notebook in a way that was visible but not theatrical. When it was done, she and Gideon stepped aside. "The second variety," she said quietly. "The resistant strain. It's 12 cents more per bushel of seed, but Ferris said himself last season's red winter had trouble in the eastern counties with rust. We're planting the east field for the first time. That soil is going to behave differently than the established ground." He thought about it. "The cost difference over the acreage is about $4, she said. "If the red winter gets rust in the new field, you lose the entire east field's yield. First year east field yield, even conservative, would be worth $60 to $70. $4 is not a real question." He looked at her. She looked back. "It's your decision," she said. "It's your money." "What would you decide? I just told you." He ordered the resistant strain. On the way out, Ferris made a comment. It was not said to Mara directly, it was said to the general air somewhere between her and the door, with the specific cowardice of men who want their condescension heard but not attributable. Something about Eastern women and farming instinct, delivered with a smile that was designed to pass as friendly. Gideon stopped walking. He turned around. He was not a man who made speeches. He had never been a man who made speeches. But he stood in Aldous Ferris's doorway for a moment and looked at the man, and something in his expression apparently communicated clearly enough what he thought of the comment, because Ferris's smile failed before Gideon said a word. "Miss Bellamy," Gideon said, without taking his eyes off Ferris, "just saved me money on the seed order and probably the Eastfield yield for the season. I'd be grateful if you'd keep your opinions about farming instinct to yourself in the future." He turned and walked out. Mara was waiting on the boardwalk. She had heard. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't quite seen from her before, not gratitude, not relief. Something quieter than that. Something that registered something before her face arranged itself back into its usual composure. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know. He'll overcharge you next time." "He'll know not to do that again," Gideon said. "Either way suits me." They walked to the next errand in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd started the morning with. The summer came in fast and hard that year, the way Kansas summers do, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like the plains had decided winter was over and had moved directly to its counter-argument. The wheat went in on schedule across the established fields, and on the east field it went in 2 weeks after that. When the broken ground had settled and Mara's observation about the resistant strain had become a conversation, the two of them returned to several times as they watched the eastern counties' reports in the weekly newspaper and noted, without particular satisfaction, that the rust warnings were real. In June, the east field showed its first green. Gideon walked its edge on a Tuesday morning when the light was still low, before the day's heat arrived. He could see the new growth in clean, even rows not perfect, There were gaps where the irregular furrows had caused inconsistent seeding, and a section near the buried rock had filled in later than the rest and would probably yield less. But it was growing. The field he'd looked at for 2 years and told himself was beyond one person's capacity was growing. He went back to the house and told Mara. She was at the table with the accounts. She looked up and said, "Which sections filled in first?" He told her. She made a note and nodded and asked about the gap near the fence line. He answered. She made another note. She did not make more of it than it was. She didn't gush or declare or perform excitement. She just received the information and added it to the picture she was building. He found that he didn't need her to make more of it than it was. The fact that she received it at all, that there was someone to tell, was the thing. By midsummer, the ranch had a shape it hadn't had in years. Not a different ranch, the same cattle and fields and daily demands, but with a different quality to it. Things got done before they became problems. The kitchen garden, which Gideon had maintained in a perfunctory way since Lenora left, expanded under Mara's attention into something that actually produced, with the particular logic of a woman who understood the difference between planting what you think you should have and planting what you actually eat. The accounts were cleaner than they'd been in years. The feed costs reduced through the supplier comparison she'd pursued with Harrington. The savings not dramatic in isolation, but accumulating month by month into something that felt like margin the breathing room a ranch needed to survive a bad year without making desperate decisions. And the neighbors started noticing. It began with small things. Ed and Clara Hannigan, who ran the neighboring property to the north, and who had known Gideon since the early years, stopped by in late June ostensibly to return a borrowed tool but stayed for 2 hours and left having consulted Mara about their own accounting practices after she made a comment, casual and completely uninvited, about the way they were tracking their cattle purchase costs. She had not been wrong about what she noticed, and Ed Hannigan was a practical man who could recognize useful information regardless of its source. He came back alone the following week to ask a follow-up question. Clara Hannigan came back 2 weeks after that and asked Mara about the kitchen garden. A man named Horace Pruitt, who ran a sheep operation 6 miles west and who had the social antenna of someone who had spent decades tracking which neighbors were worth knowing better, rode by one morning in July and managed to time his arrival so that it coincided with the morning coffee hour, which he then extended by a careful 40 minutes. At the end of which he'd had a conversation with Mara about wool pricing and regional feed costs that left him looking thoughtful in the way men look when someone has just said something that will take them a while to fully process. Gideon watched this from the edge of his own kitchen, where he was supposed to be eating breakfast. "You've done this before," he said, after Pruitt left. Mara looked at him. "Done what?" Made people think the conversation was about something simple, and then he gestured at the door. "He came to look at you. He left thinking about his feed costs." She considered this. "I've found," she said, "that people are more comfortable with what you know if they discover it in the middle of a conversation about something else." He looked at her steadily. "That's not as innocent a strategy as you're making it sound." "No," she said, "but it's not harmful either. Pruitt needed to think about his feed costs. He'll benefit from thinking about his feed costs. I just made it easier for him to get there without feeling like he was being taught something by a woman he'd never met." She looked back at her coffee. "It's a practical adjustment to a practical reality." He sat down across from her. "Miss Bellamy," he said. She looked up. "We've been here for almost 3 months," he said. 91 days, she said, and then, immediately, with something that was not quite embarrassment but was adjacent to it, "I wasn't counting specifically. I just happened to notice." "I've been counting too," he said. She was quiet. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. He had been working up to this for approximately 3 weeks. In the careful, procrastinating way, he did things that mattered more than he knew how to manage. He'd rehearsed it less than he'd rehearsed the speech at the train platform, because rehearsal had not helped him then, and he suspected it was not going to help him now. "And I want to ask it correctly, which means I want to be clear about what I'm asking and what I'm not asking." She waited. "What I'm not asking," he said, "is whether you'll stay because the ranch needs the help." "It does, and that's true, but it's not the reason. He looked at his hands on the table, those work-scared hands that had built most of what surrounded them. What I'm asking is whether you want to make this permanent. Whether you want to stay because this is yours too. Because you want it to be. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the summer morning was doing what summer mornings in Kansas did, building toward heat. The grass is already starting to give off that particular dry green smell that meant the season was at its fullest. Mara looked at him across the table. I already think of it as mine, she said. That happened somewhere around the 4th day. That's when we finished the ceiling. When we finished the ceiling, she confirmed. He looked at her. I'm asking you to marry me, he said properly. With a ceremony and witnesses, not just the arrangement we have. She considered him for a moment in the way she considered everything directly, without performance. Then she said, I'm not particularly concerned with formality. Neither am I, he said, but I want to be correct about what this is. Something in her face shifted, and this time, it was not the careful, controlled shift he'd learned to watch for. This was something more fundamental, something that went through her composure rather than managing it. Her eyes were suddenly brighter than they'd been a moment before, which she appeared to notice and did not apologize for. Yes, she said, Mr. Rourke. Gideon, he said, a pause. Yes, she said again, Gideon. They were married in September in the small ceremony that was available to people who were practical about formality. A circuit judge who came through Red Hollow on the 1st of the month, Martha Ellison and her husband as witnesses. Clem standing in the back with his hat in his hands, looking as though he was not sure whether to be moved or confused, and eventually settling on both. It took 20 minutes. Mara wore the same gray dress she'd arrived in, which she had by now altered and cleaned to the point where it was neither the dress she'd arrived in nor a different dress, just the dress, hers, improved by time and attention. Gideon wore the shirt from the cedar chest. Afterward, they went home, because there were cattle to check and an east field to monitor and a fence on the south boundary that had been developing a lean and was going to need addressing before the season turned. Clara Hannigan sent a pie. It sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before they remembered to cut into it, because there was always something else that needed doing first. But they ate it, eventually, in the evening, with the account spread across the other half of the table, and it was a good pie. She used local honey instead of full sugar, which was the kind of choice that showed someone who understood what they had, and Mara said so. And Gideon said he'd tell Ed, and Mara said to tell Clara since Clara had made it, and Gideon acknowledged that was the correct thing, and said he'd tell Clara. Then they went back to the accounts. It was, in its way, the most ordinary evening of either of their lives. And then October arrived, and with it the first edge of real cold, and the particular change in the wind that Kansas people learned to read the way sailors read weather over water. Gideon felt it on the first day of the month, standing in the east field looking at the wheat that had been harvested, the stubble cut close, the soil bare and waiting for the turning. He felt the wind and thought early winter. He was usually right about early winters. He'd had enough of them to develop the instinct. He went inside and looked at Mara, who was at the table with the feed inventory. We need to order additional feed, he said, before the road gets difficult. She looked up. Her eyes had the set they got when she was already ahead of the conversation. I've been looking at the inventory, she said. We have enough to carry the herd through a moderate winter. If it runs long, we have a shortfall starting around January. She turned the inventory sheet so he could see her calculations. I added up the order we'd need to cover through a long season. He looked at the numbers. You were all ready. I noticed the wind changed this morning, she said. He looked at her. Early winter, she said. You've been here 6 months, he said. You've never seen a Kansas winter. No, she said. But you've told me about them, and the almanac suggested early turn, and this morning the wind felt different than yesterday. She met his eyes. Am I wrong? No, he said. You're not wrong. She had made the calculations assuming a long winter, not a moderate one. The order she'd drafted would cover the herd through February. He looked at it, and then he looked at the bottom line, which was not a comfortable number. It's expensive, he said. A dead herd in January is more expensive, she said. He thought about 1,876. He thought about the winter he didn't tell people about anymore. Yes, he said, They sent the order that week. November arrived hard. The first serious cold came the second week of the month. Not a gradual descent, but a sudden drop that Gideon had been watching for, and that still managed to arrive faster than anticipated. The cattle moved to the winter pasture on November 8th. The storm preparations that Mara had been organizing for the past 3 weeks, feed staged in accessible locations, firewood stacked in 2 places rather than 1, the house supplies inventoried and replenished, the barn doors rehung so the latch worked properly in frozen weather. Those preparations became the structure they were living inside. Gideon noticed something in those weeks. He noticed that Mara was not managing the preparations the way a guest manages the household of someone else. She was not consulting him on every decision, not deferring to his established patterns, not asking permission for the reorganization of the firewood stacking method, or the repositioning of the emergency lamp supply. She was managing it the way someone manages their own home, with the confidence of a person whose judgment has been tested and who has stopped apologizing for trusting it. He noticed it, and he did not object to it, and the fact that he did not object to it was itself a change from the man who had reached for her carpet bag at the train station and been told she had it. In the 3rd week of November, she found the flu. She had developed the habit he couldn't say. When it had started, it had grown so gradually of checking the stove every morning as part of her routine. Not obsessively, not fearfully, but with the specific attention of someone who had helped repair one chimney and had learned from that repair exactly what to watch for. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November, she made her check and found something. She came to find him in the barn. "The new flashing on the chimney," she said. "Come look at something." He followed her back to the house. She showed him not the chimney itself, but the ceiling below it, where a faint dark line had appeared at the joint between the new work and the old. Not a crack, not yet, just a shadow, the kind of shadow that could mean settling or could mean the beginning of a problem. "I need to get up there today," he said. "The wind is from the north," she said. "Wait until it shifts, if that's the flashing moving." "I know, but going up in a north wind is more dangerous than a one-day wait." She looked at the ceiling. "Light the stove carefully tonight. Small fire. Check the draft before you build it up." She looked at him. "I'll watch the ceiling." He looked at her. "I'll watch the ceiling," she said again. "I know what I'm looking for." He let her. He went up the next morning when the wind had dropped. The flashing had shifted a small movement, the kind that happens with temperature differential between new and old materials in the first seasons after a repair, not unexpected but requiring correction before the gap it was beginning to create allowed water or heat to find a path it shouldn't have. He reseated the flashing and resecured it and came down and told Mara. "Is it stable?" she said. "It is now. What would have happened if we'd waited until spring?" He thought about what water in that gap would have done over a Kansas winter. "Nothing good," he said. She nodded. "I'll check it weekly," she said. "I'll check it weekly," he said. "With you." She looked at him, gave him a small nod that was not quite a smile, but had the warmth of one. They went back to work. The cold deepened through late November. The days shortened until it seemed like the dark arrived before you were ready for it, and the mornings required effort, not just physical effort, but the particular act of will required to put yourself back into the cold after a warm night, to face the barn and the wind and the frozen water trough with the same willingness you'd brought yesterday and the day before. Gideon had been doing this for 11 years. He knew the rhythm of it, the endurance it required, the way you got through a plains winter, not by fighting it, but by settling into it, expecting its terms. What he had not known for 11 years was what it felt like to do it with someone. He had known abstractly that it must be different. He had not known how different. He had not known that the act of coming in from the cold to a kitchen that was warm because someone had tended the stove was not just physically better, but was different in some more fundamental way, that it was the difference between an existence that was sustained and an existence that was inhabited. He had sustained himself for 5 years. He had forgotten until now what it felt like to inhabit something. It was Mara who reminded him, not by saying anything about it. Not by being warm and welcoming in any performed way. She was not a performed person. Warmth was not something she announced. She reminded him simply by being there, by her footsteps on the floorboards in the morning, by her voice asking practical questions about the herd, by the way she left the lamp burning in the kitchen when he was late coming in from the barn. Not because she'd decided to make a gesture, but because there was work to do at the table, and the lamp needed to be lit anyway. December brought the first real storm. It came from the northwest on a Thursday, and Gideon had 3 days' warning from the sky and the behavior of the cattle who knew before the instruments knew, who began moving together and facing south and eating more than they needed, and he spent those 3 days doing what needed doing. Extra feed in accessible places the barn secured. The house wood doubled, the water situation managed as much as it could be managed. On the night the storm arrived, he sat in the kitchen across from Mara, and the wind hit the house with a sound that had no exact parallel, a roar that was also a pressure. A thing you felt in your chest, as much as heard with your ears, and he watched her hear it for the first time. She looked up from the accounts she'd been working on. Her hands were still on the page. She was listening. The house groaned once deep in its framing. "The north wall," she said. "It always does that," he said. "It's braced properly. It's just noise." She listened to the noise. He watched her listen to it, the same focused attention she'd given to the sounds of the house on her first night, counting and filing and building a picture of what was the house settling and what was something else. 3 times, she said after a moment. "Usually about that," he said. She nodded, went back to the accounts. He looked at her across the table, this woman who had arrived with one carpet bag and a letter folded soft at the creases, who had walked into a damaged house without hesitation, who had helped repair a ceiling and break a field and catch a flashing shift, and who was now sitting in his kitchen in a December storm, listening to the north wall with the composure of someone who intended to be here when the storm was over. He understood, sitting there in the warmth they had built between them, why the first winter had broken what came before. Lenora had endured the winter. She had sat inside it and waited for it to be over and counted the days. He had not blamed her, for she had been honest about what she was, and he had not listened, but the difference between endurance and inhabiting, between waiting for something to pass and becoming part of the life around it, was the difference between a woman who had left and a woman who was counting the number of times the north wall groaned so that she would stop being startled by it. He looked at Mara. She looked up. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him a moment longer with the particular quality she had of reading the difference was between nothing that was nothing and nothing that was something. Then she went back to the accounts. The storm ran 3 days. The drifts on the north side of the barn reached the windowsills. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that had a personality to it, not just an absence of warmth but an active presence, something that pressed against the house and tested its seams. Gideon went to the barn twice a day, which was required, which he had always done, which would always be brutal in weather like this. But he came back to a house that was warm, and there was coffee. And Mara told him what she'd done while he was out, the feed calculation she'd revised based on the storm's length, the chimney check she'd done in the morning, the crack she'd noticed developing in the mortar around the base of the stove that needed addressing when the weather broke, and that she'd already worked out would require a specific mix of lime and sand in proportions she'd written down so he'd have the information when he needed it. He drank the coffee. He listened to the specifics. He thought about the winter of 1878, when he had come in from the barn to a kitchen that was quiet, when Lenora had been sitting in the chair by the window, with her hands folded in her lap and her bag already packed, and she had looked at him with the eyes of someone who had already made a decision and was only waiting for the moment to say it. He thought about that winter, and then he looked at Mara making notes about stove mortar, and something that had been braced in him for 5 years, not relaxed, not dissolved, but fundamentally changed in its quality, shifted from braced to simply present. He was not waiting for her to leave. He was not counting the days until she proved him right about abandonment. He was sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee in a December storm, and his wife was writing down the proportions for lime and sand mortar because she had already decided that the stove was her stove, and the house was her house, and the winter was hers to be part of, not hers to survive. He set down his cup. Mara, he said. She looked up. I'm glad you stayed, he said, at the platform, when I gave you the reason to go back. She looked at him. I know you are, she said. I'm trying to tell you that I understand now what that cost, he said. Choosing to stay in a situation you hadn't seen the full shape of yet. It was brave, and I didn't know then how to say that. She was quiet for a moment. The storm moved against the house. The north wall groaned twice, and she didn't flinch. It wasn't brave, she said. Brave is when you're afraid and you do it anyway. I wasn't afraid of the house, Gideon. She looked down at her notes and then back up at him. I was afraid that it wouldn't work, that we wouldn't, that I'd made the choice and it would be the wrong one, and I'd be starting over again, alone at 34. She paused. But the house? The ceiling? No, that was just a house with a problem. Houses have problems, and the fear, he said, about us. She met his eyes. Still there, she said some. He thought about honesty. Same, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She reached across the table and put her hand on his briefly, and squeezed once and took her hand back. Then she went back to the mortar calculations. He sat with the warmth of that brief contact and the sound of the storm and the smell of the coffee and the low, steady heat of the kitchen stove, and he thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. Not the dramatic version he'd imagined in lonely years, not the simple version he'd told himself would be enough. This version, specific and imperfect and real, with fear still present and mortar calculations on the table and 3 days of storm still to get through. This one. Outside, the December plains were white and absolute and brutal and indifferent, and inside the house Gideon Rourke had built with his own hands, with the chimney that had been repaired, and the ceiling that was sound, and the north wall that groaned twice between midnight and 2, a woman who had traveled 4 days with one carpet bag was writing down the proportions for stove mortar and occasionally looking up to check the draft. The storm did not care about any of this. The storm did what Kansas storms do. And they managed it together, which was, in the end, the only way anything worth managing ever gets done. The storm broke on a Saturday. Gideon knew it before he opened his eyes. The quality of the silence had changed. 3 days of wind had become so constant that the absence of it had its own sound, a held-breath quiet that was somehow louder than the roaring had been. He lay still for a moment and listened to it, and then he got up and went to the window and looked out at a world that had been remade overnight into something flat and white and almost painfully bright, the kind of brightness that came when new snow caught early light and threw it back doubled. The drifts on the north side of the barn were higher than he'd estimated. The fence line on the west boundary had disappeared entirely under the accumulation. The cattle, he could see them from the window, clustered in the south corner of the winter pasture, where the natural wind shadow of the terrain had kept the drifting manageable, were standing and moving, which was the first thing you needed to know on a morning after a storm of that size. He dressed. He went to the kitchen. Mara was already up. The stove was going. The coffee was made, and she was standing at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around her cup, looking at the same white world he'd just seen from the bedroom. She had her work clothes on. She had been up long enough to tend the stove and make the coffee and assess the situation and formulate what he suspected was a fairly complete plan for the morning, because that was what she did. The south fence, she said, without turning around. I saw it. The cattle are all right, she said. I counted from the window. Twice. He stopped. You counted 38 head from the kitchen window? 37, she said. I counted 37 twice. The same 37, I think, but I want to be sure. She finally turned to look at him. The Hannigan side of the property, is there a drift pattern there that could pull one through the fence? He thought about the fence on the Hannigan boundary, the section near the low ground where water ran in spring. There's one spot, he said. I'll check it first. I'll come. The drifts are deep, she said. I can see that. I'll come anyway. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He reached for his coat. The missing animal was not through the Hannigan fence. It was in the gully, at the northeast corner of the winter pasture, which was separated from the main cluster by a drift. It had apparently either walked into in the dark or gotten pushed toward in the wind. It was standing in snow to its knees, not in distress, not injured, just stuck in the particular stubborn way that cattle get stuck, unwilling to commit to the effort of extraction and waiting with bovine patience for the problem to solve itself. Gideon went in on one side. Mara, without being asked, went in on the other side, wading through thigh-deep snow in her work boots with an expression of focused concentration and absolutely no complaint. And together they moved the animal back toward the main group with the unglamorous combination of physical pressure and increasingly impolite noise that is the actual reality of cattle work in winter conditions. And by the time it was done, they were both soaked from the knees down and breathing hard, and Mara had snow up the inside of her left sleeve where she'd lost her footing and caught herself with her arm. 38, all present. She counted them standing at the pasture gate with snow melting down the inside of her sleeve, her lips moving slightly, her eyes going from animal to animal with methodical attention. He watched her count. He had always counted alone, a private arithmetic that was the first and last number of every winter day. Watching her do it beside him felt strange in the way that sharing any habit feels strange when you realize you've stopped doing it alone. 38, she said. 38, he confirmed. She pulled the sleeve away from her wrist and looked at the snow inside it with a practical lack of drama. Then she pulled the cuff down and turned back toward the house. The south fence, she said, after we get dry. They got dry. They went to the south fence. Half of one section had gone over under the drift pressure not broken, just knocked flat. The posts still intact in the frozen ground, the wire still attached, the whole thing lying on its side under 2 feet of snow and requiring excavation before it could be reset. The work took the rest of the morning, and into early afternoon, the two of them digging and resetting and tamping, their breath coming in clouds, the cold having dropped back to something serious after the storm's passage. At one point, Gideon's post-tamper glanced off a half-frozen section of ground and caught him on the back of his left hand, hard enough to make him hiss through his teeth and stop working. Mara looked over. "How bad?" "Fine," he said, with the specific masculinity of men who have just hurt themselves and need a moment to determine whether the correct response is acknowledgement or denial. "Let me see." I said it's fine, and I said let me see. She set down her tools and came around the fence post and held out her hand. He showed her his hand. The knuckle was already swelling, the skin scraped but not broken, the kind of impact that would be colorful by morning, but that did not represent any structural problem. She looked at it with the assessing eye she brought to house damage and crop assessments and stove mortar, pressed gently at the joint to check the motion. "It works," he said, opening and closing his fingers. "I can see that. It's going to be stiff tomorrow. I've had worse. That's not reassurance," she said. She let go of his hand, work with the right side. "I'll handle the left posts," he started to object. She was already moving to the left post. He stood for a moment in the cold with his scraped knuckle and the particular feeling of a man whose instinct is to argue, and who has gradually and imperfectly been learning when that instinct is not serving him. He moved to the right side. They finished the fence by 2 in the afternoon. On the way back to the house, they passed the east field buried under its uniform white blanket, the stubble of the harvested wheat invisible, the whole acreage just a plain of snow indistinguishable from everything around it. Gideon glanced at it without stopping. In his head, it was already spring. He was already calculating the next planting, the variety question, whether to expand the acreage further or consolidate the existing ground with better technique. "Same variety next year?" Mara asked. He looked at her. "Were you reading my mind?" "You looked at the field," she said. "You always look at the field when you're planning something." He thought about that. "Same variety," he said. "And I want to extend the western edge by another 6 rows if the soil breaks right. We'll need to check the fence there first. That corner took the most drift pressure." "I know, spring checklist," she said. "It's December." "It will still be spring," she said, "and the list doesn't get shorter by ignoring it." He made a sound that was not disagreement. She took it as the agreement it was. January came in gray and grinding. The kind of month that did not have the drama of the December storm, but had its own particular endurance test, the endless repetition of cold days. The short light, the way the ranch contracted to its essential operations, and everything else went dormant, including certain varieties of human patience. Gideon had weathered more Januaries than he liked to count, And he knew that this was when the winter showed you who you were, not in the dramatic moments, but in the daily ones. The mornings when there was nothing new to address and everything still had to be done. The evenings when the lamp burned and the wind didn't stop, and there was nothing left to talk about that hadn't been said. He had spent 5 of these Januaries alone. He had not understood during any of them how much of his energy he had been spending simply on managing the silence. With Mara, January was different. Not easier in any absolute sense. The cold was the same cold. The work was the same work. The days were still short and the nights were still long, and there were mornings when getting out of bed required a specific act of will that he remembered from every previous winter. But the silence had changed its quality. It was no longer the silence of a house waiting for something that wasn't coming. It was the silence of 2 people reading, or 2 people working, or 2 people each occupied with their own thinking in proximity to each other. It was inhabited silence, which was a different thing entirely. Some evenings they talked. Not about anything that would seem significant to an observer, the spring planting, the feed inventory, a question Mara had about the pricing at the Harrington supplier. A story Gideon told about the summer of '79 when the grasshoppers came and ate everything including the fence post tops, which she had not believed, and which he had substantiated from memory in enough specific detail that she'd conceded the point while still looking skeptical. Some evenings they were each in their own thinking, and the kitchen was quiet, and that was also fine. One evening in the middle of January, Mara asked about Lenora. She did not ask the way he would have dreaded being asked, not with an agenda, not with the particular emotional excavation that he associated with conversations designed to produce feeling rather than information. She asked the way she asked about the fence or the east field directly, and with the implication that the answer was information she needed and that she could be trusted with it. "What was she like?" Mara said. "If you want to tell me." He thought about it for a while, the lamp between them on the table, the stove doing its work. She was kind, he said, genuinely kind, not performed. She liked people, and people liked her. She would have been happy in a city. Anywhere, there were neighbors close enough to see daily. She was not built for distance. He was quiet for a moment. "I knew that. Before I married her, I knew it." "Why did you marry her?" He looked at his hands. "I was 34, and I'd been alone 3 years, and I'd built something worth sharing. And there was no one to share it with." And she said yes. He paused. "That's a bad reason to marry someone." "It's a human reason," Mara said. "Same thing sometimes." "Did she know you knew? That she wasn't built for it?" "I don't think I'd admitted it to myself clearly enough to know whether I'd communicated it," he said. "I think I believed that that caring about a place would transfer. That if she loved me, she'd come to love the life." He shook his head slightly. "It doesn't work that way." "No," Mara said. "What you love and what you can endure are different," he said. "She loved me. She could not endure Kansas in winter." Both of those things were true at the same time. Mara was quiet. Outside, the wind moved along the north wall. Twice. She didn't count it anymore. She'd learned the sound well enough that it had simply become part of the house's voice. "I thought about that," she said, "before I came. Whether I was built for it." "What did you decide?" "That I'd grown up moving every year or 2, in houses that were other people's houses, in towns where I was always the carpenter's daughter who'd be gone by spring." She looked at the lamp. "I didn't know if I was built for a permanent place. I'd never had one, but I knew I wasn't built for the alternative anymore." He looked at her. "The 4 conversations a week," she said. "I couldn't keep doing that." He understood that. He understood it in the specific way you understand things you have lived through rather than thought through. "When did you know you could stay?" he said. "Not would." "Could," she thought about it. "The ceiling," she said. "When we finished the ceiling," she glanced at the bedroom door. "I'd been useful, actually useful, not ornamental. I'd done something that mattered to something that was becoming mine." She paused. "That was when I stopped thinking about whether I'd made the right decision." "And now?" "Now I think about the spring planting and the west fence, and whether Clem is going to come back in March, or whether we need to arrange something before then," she said. "So I suppose I've stopped thinking about the decision entirely." He looked at her across the lamp. He had a thought he did not say, which was that this was more than he had hoped for when he'd written the letter. He had hoped for someone capable and present. He had gotten someone who had made the ranch more itself than it had been before she arrived, who had found the gap in the siding, and the shift in the flashing, and the rust problem with the seed variety, and the feed cost discrepancy at Lundquist's, who had waded into thigh-deep snow to move a stuck animal and made coffee before he woke up, and counted cattle from the kitchen window, and learned the sounds of his house, until she stopped being startled by them. He had gotten considerably more than he'd known to ask for. He didn't say any of this. He was not a man who said those things easily, and she was not a woman who required them said. But he thought them, clearly, at the kitchen table in January, with the lamp between them and the wind on the north wall, and he let himself think them fully rather than stopping them at the edge, as he used to stop things that felt too large to be safe. February brought a smaller storm, meaner than the December event, but shorter 2 days of hard wind and cold that dropped the temperature to a number that Gideon checked on the outdoor thermometer twice because he didn't trust the first reading. The livestock came through it without significant losses. One of the younger cattle developed a respiratory problem that Gideon and Mara monitored through both days of the storm, taking turns checking on the animal every 4 hours, and which resolved on its own by the third day, in the way that animal illness will sometimes resolve if you watch it carefully and intervene before it gets worse rather than after. In the middle of the second night of that storm, Mara's turn to check the barn, Gideon woke at 2 a.m. and found the house empty and the lamp gone, and 6 minutes passed without her returning. He lay in the dark for approximately 30 seconds before he got up. He had his coat on before he'd fully formed a reason to be concerned. The rational part of him said she was fine, that 6 minutes was nothing, that the barn was 40 yards away and visibility was poor, and she was careful and competent. The other part of him, the part that had spent 5 years sleeping with one ear, tuned to the quality of silence, got him dressed and out the kitchen door into the wind and cold before the rational argument had finished making its case. She was fine. She was in the barn, standing in the stall with the sick animal, and she had brought the lamp close to examine something she'd noticed about the animal's breathing pattern that she wanted to look at more carefully. She had lost track of time. She looked up when he came in and read his expression immediately. "I'm all right," she said. "I found something. Come look at this." "The breathing is, I know," he said. "Come look at it." He crossed the barn to where she was standing. She showed him. The animal's breathing had developed an asymmetry that was subtle but real, slightly more effort on the left side than the right. The kind of detail that you could miss if you weren't looking for it, and that could mean several things, not all of them serious. "I don't think it's the lungs," she said. "I think there's something in the left nostril. The way she's compensating." He looked. He got the lamp closer and looked at the animal's nostril. Found a ball of compacted mucus the size of his thumb, frozen at the edges from the cold, blocking the passage. He cleared it, not pleasant work, but quick, and the animal's breathing evened out almost immediately. Mara watched. "That was it," she said. "That was it. I would have found it if I'd had another few minutes." "I know you would have." She looked at him. She read the expression again, the one he'd come in with, the one he was now trying to normalize back to its daytime version. "You were worried," she said. "You were overdue," he said. "By a few minutes. In a storm in the dark, a few minutes is yes." "I was worried." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face that was not quite the thing she'd shown when he defended her at Ferris's. This was softer, less composed. Like something had surprised her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Manage the worry alone, you can say it." He looked at her. "I just said it. You said you were worried, past tense." She held his gaze. "I mean, you can say it before. When you're worried. You don't have to come into the barn already managing it." He thought about what she was describing. The specific habit of a man who had learned that expressing concern meant exposing a dependency he could not afford because the person he depended on might leave. "I'm working on it," he said. She nodded. "That's the right answer," she said. The same word she'd used on that first morning when he had acknowledged he wasn't fully past the Lenora reflex. She seemed to be collecting his right answers, storing them somewhere. They checked the rest of the animals together. Then they went back to the house together, through the wind and the dark, and he kept the lamp, and she walked close enough that her arm was against his. Not because the path required it, but because the cold did, and because they had been married for 4 months and had progressed past the careful foot of distance that strangers maintain when they are being respectful about being strangers. The storm passed, February ended. March arrived with the tentative, unreliable quality of early Kansas spring, some days warm enough to produce mud, other days reverting to cold hard enough to refreeze it, the land in a state of indecision that required a person to stay flexible about their plans and not commit too hard to any particular expectation. Clem came back. He arrived in the first week of March on the family horse with his hat in his hands. He always his hat in his hands when he arrived, as though he was perpetually presenting himself for consideration, and he was taller than he'd been in November, which was the kind of thing that happened with 16-year-olds, and that Gideon always noticed with a slight sense of time misbehaving. He looked at Mara with the wary respect of a boy who has spent 4 months hearing his family discuss someone he hadn't fully formed an opinion about yet. The community of Red Hollow had been having a sustained conversation about Mara Rourke through the winter, not maliciously, not particularly, in the way that small communities have sustained conversations about anything that represents a change in a known situation, and Clem had been present for his share of it, mostly at the supper table, mostly filtering out the commentary that seemed to be about something other than what it claimed to be about. "She's still fixing things," his mother had asked once, with a tone that tried to be neutral and didn't quite get there. "She found a thing wrong with the chimney flashing before it became a problem," Clem had reported, which was what he'd heard and which had seemed to him, at 16, like a straightforward and positive fact. His mother had said something about Eastern women and what they understood about frontier life, and Clem had eaten his supper and thought that the chimney flashing seemed like the kind of thing you'd want someone to find before it became a problem. But he was 16 and did not say this. He reported for work in March with the neutrality of a boy trying to observe and form his own conclusion. By the end of the first week, the conclusion had formed. On a Thursday in mid-March, he was working in the barn when he overheard Gideon and Mara having a disagreement. This was not an unusual occurrence. They disagreed regularly, in the direct and sometimes heated way of people who both have opinions and don't perform agreement as a social grace. This particular disagreement was about the timing of the spring planting on the west field, where Gideon wanted to start early, and Mara thought the soil temperature was still too low and that starting early would cost them germination percentage. "The almanac says Gideon started. The almanac says average," Mara said. "This spring is behind average. Feel the ground in the north corner where the sun doesn't get until afternoon. That's your germination temperature in the worst of the field. I've been planting this field for 11 years. And I've been reading soil temperature indicators for 6 months, but I learned what I know from a man who built houses for 30 years and who taught me that the average is where you start thinking, not where you stop." Her voice was not raised, but it had an edge that meant she was not budging. 3 days, Gideon. Wait 3 days and check the north corner again." A pause. 3 days, he said, like a man conceding a point he's not fully conceding. "Thank you," she said. "I still think the almanac." "I know you do." Clem heard this from the barn and went back to the hay with a feeling that was something like relief, because what he'd heard was two people who didn't make each other smaller to make themselves more comfortable. He had been in enough houses as a hired hand to know that this was not as common as it should be. He came back the following week, and the week after that. The west field was planted 3 days later than Gideon had wanted, and 4 days before he would have planted it alone. The north corner germinated at a rate that matched the rest of the field within acceptable variance. No one made a specific point of this, but Mara's spring checklist gained an annotation about soil temperature monitoring that she wrote in the margin without comment. Spring brought the predictable cascade of everything that had been waiting. The fences, all of them needed post-by-post assessment after the winter. The barn needed attention in 2 places where the roof had taken drift weight. The east field needed its spring turning. The kitchen garden was expanded again, this time with a plan Mara had developed over the winter that was organized around what actually got eaten rather than what seemed like a good idea in the catalog. She had also, sometime in February, begun keeping a different kind of record. He found it by accident on a Saturday in April, when he was looking for the feed cost comparison she'd done on the Harrington supplier and pulled the wrong journal from the shelf. It was a narrow book, not the ledger and not the accounts notebook he'd seen her use daily. He opened it before he realized it wasn't what he was looking for, and he read 3 lines before he realized what it was, and then he closed it. He stood with the closed notebook in his hand for a moment. He put it back exactly where it had been. He found the feed comparison in the next journal along. But what he'd read stayed with him. 3 lines. The first, north wall twice, around 1A. The second noted, Gideon checks the Eastfield boundary every evening. Before coming in, faces north-northeast, not toward the field but across the Hannigan line. Watching something. The third line, which was the one he kept returning to, I think he is still waiting for the thing that left to come back. I don't know how to tell him it already has. He did not mention the journal. It was hers, her private accounting of what she was learning, the same way she accounted for everything she was learning, because that was how she was built, and he had known that from the first morning. But the third line stayed. He thought about it on the Saturday morning, mixing the lime compound for a repair on the Springhouse foundation. He thought about it in the afternoon, checking the Eastfield boundary, which he had apparently been doing in a way that was visible enough for her to note and precise enough for her to read correctly. He thought about it in the evening, coming in from the last barn check, when he stopped at the kitchen door and looked through the window at Mara, at the table with the lamp and the accounts, her head bent, her pen moving, completely unaware she was being watched. She was right. He was still turning sometimes to check the road. Not often, not consciously, but the body keeps its habits long after the mind has moved on, and the habit of a man who spent 5 years expecting departure was not fully dissolved by 6 months of not departing. He came inside. She looked up. "Well, barn's fine," he said. "The Hannigan fence has a post that needs resetting." "I'll get to it Monday. I'll note it," she said, and wrote it down. He sat at the table. He thought about saying something about the journal, about the line, about the thing she'd written that had been the most precise description of his interior architecture that anyone, including himself, had ever produced. He thought about how to say it. He thought about whether she needed him to say it. He decided she probably already knew. She knew most things eventually. It was one of the facts of living with her. "Mara," he said. She looked up. "I've been watching the North Road," he said. "I didn't know I was doing it until recently." She held his gaze. "I know what it means," he said, "and I want you to know that I know, that I'm aware of it, that I don't actually expect you to leave. It's just the body doing something the mind has moved past." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "How long has the mind moved past it?" she said. He thought about the ceiling, about February and the barn and her arm against his in the wind, about January and the lamp and the inhabited silence. "A while," he said. "Good," she said. She went back to the accounts. He stayed at the table. After a moment, he pulled the Eastfield planting record toward him and started reviewing the germination notes from the spring, and the kitchen settled into its evening quiet, and neither of them said anything else about it. It was not a resolution. It was not a clean arrival at some new and better version of things. The body's habits continued their slow revision. He still checked the road sometimes less, and with more awareness of what he was doing, and with the growing recognition that what he found when he checked was not an empty road waiting to show him something leaving, but a road that was simply the road, leading somewhere else, and that here was where the people were. April moved into May. The Eastfield planted, the spring cattle work done. The property moving through its seasonal rhythms with the discipline of an operation that had been thought through rather than managed on instinct alone. There was a day in the middle of May when the whole sequence of the previous year became visible to Gideon in the specific way that certain things become visible only when you're far enough from their beginning to see their full shape. He was standing in the Eastfield, his Eastfield, their Eastfield, the one that had been 2 years fallow, and that was now in its second productive season, looking at the young wheat that had come up clean, and he was thinking about Mara's recommendation on the resistance strain, and about the $4 it had cost, and about the rust warnings in the eastern counties newspapers that spring, which were as real as she'd said they would be, and he had a sudden, complete understanding of what would have happened to this field in its first season if he'd made the decision alone. He would have planted the cheaper variety. He would have watched it come up and probably would have lost 15 to 20% of the yield to rust before he'd understood what was happening. He would have had a first season in the East Field that barely justified the work of breaking it. Instead, the field was clean. It was clean because there had been someone to ask the next question. He stood in the field and thought about all the times in the past year he'd started a sentence with the assumption that the answer was already settled, and Mara had, without drama or insistence, asked the question that revealed it wasn't. The feed supplier, the seed variety, the chimney flashing, the north corner germination temperature. Each one a version of the same thing, a person who looked at what he'd decided and asked whether he'd considered something else, and who was right often enough that he'd learned to stop being defensive about it. He was not less of a rancher than he'd been a year ago. He was a better one, not because he'd been corrected, but because he'd stopped operating in the specific limitation of one person's view. He did not believe in debt in relationships. He did not think of it as owing or being owed. But he recognized something that was not debt, more like ballast, the kind that makes a vessel more stable without making it heavier than it needs to be. He went back to the house. She was in the kitchen garden, which by May had become something that bore no resemblance to the perfunctory rectangle he'd maintained through the Lenora years and the Alone years. It was organized, which was not the same as orderly. There was a logic to it that wasn't immediately visible, but that revealed itself if you paid attention, the tall plants shading the ones that needed it, the root vegetables separated from the ones that competed for space, the kitchen herbs within arm's reach of the path. She had put beans on the south fence of it, and they were beginning to climb. She was crouched at the far end, doing something with the soil around the early carrot plantings, aerating it, he thought, though from this distance he couldn't be sure, and she had her back to him and hadn't heard him come across the yard. He stood for a moment and watched her work. He thought about the letter he'd written in March of the previous year, sitting at this same kitchen table at 3 a.m, with ash on his hands and an embarrassed, careful honesty he hadn't known he was capable of. He thought about what he'd hoped for when he wrote it, and how modest that hope had been, not small in feeling, but small in imagination, because you can only hope for what you can conceive, and he had not been able to conceive of this. Of someone who counted cattle from the kitchen window and found the gap in the siding, in late afternoon light, and waded through thigh-deep snow and argued about germination temperature and wrote, in a private journal he was not meant to see, that the thing that had left had already come back. He had not known to hope for this, because he had not known it existed. Mara stood up from the carrot row and turned and saw him standing at the garden edge. The beans need another stake on the south end, she said, because she had apparently already spotted what she needed to do next and was communicating it the way she communicated everything directly, as soon as it was relevant. I'll get one, he said. He went to the barn and got a stake. He came back and drove it into the garden's south fence where she indicated, and she tied the bean vine to it with a piece of cord she'd had in her pocket, because she generally had the thing she needed in her pocket, and he crouched beside her while she did the tying, and was close enough to see the concentration in her face, the particular set of her jaw that was the smaller, quieter version of the one she got when she was working through a problem. Gideon, she said, still tying the cord. Yes. Stop looking at me like that. Like what? She glanced at him. Something between exasperation and the thing that lived behind it. Like you're trying to memorize something before it disappears. He was quiet for a moment. Habit, he said. I know, she said. But it's been a year. Almost a year, close enough. She finished the knot. Stood up. Looked at him squarely. I'm not disappearing, Gideon. He looked at her. This woman in the kitchen garden in May, with soil on her hands and the bean vine secured and the carrot row aerated and the summer's work already laid out in her mind, in the same clear sequence she brought to everything. This woman who had crossed 4 days of distance with one carpet bag and walked into a damaged house and asked if the kitchen was standing. I know, he said. Do you? He thought about the North Road, about the body's habits and the mind's progress. About January at the lamp and December at the table and the cold of February in the barn when he'd gone out before he'd finished reasoning himself into it. "I'm getting there," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face was not quite a smile, and not quite something more than a smile. She reached out and brushed a piece of dried soil off his sleeve, the same brief, matter-of-fact contact she sometimes made, the kind that was not a gesture so much as a fact of proximity, of sharing the same air and the same work and the same property and the same life. "The carrots need 2 more weeks," she said. "I know," he said. She picked up her tools and headed toward the next thing on her list. He stood in the kitchen garden and watched the bean vine on the new stake, and the summer light lay flat across the yard, and the east field was green with its second season. And somewhere in the south pasture, the cattle were doing what cattle do on a warm May afternoon. And the house stood solid on its foundation, with its repaired ceiling, and its seated flashing and its north wall that groaned twice between midnight and 2. He had built this place, and then for 5 years he had maintained it. And now, for the first time in longer than he could honestly calculate, he was inhabiting it. He went to find the next stake the garden needed. The second summer settled into itself the way second years do, not with the uncertainty of the first, not with the constant low-level awareness of 2 people still measuring each other, but with something quieter and more durable. A fluency, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up in small things, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen without having to think about it, the way a decision got made between them without requiring a full conversation, the way silence had stopped being something to manage and had become simply the texture of certain evenings. The wheat harvest that August was the strongest the Rourke property had seen in 11 years. Gideon said this once, on the last morning of the harvest, standing at the Eastfield boundary. He said it the way he said things that mattered after sitting with it long enough to be sure. "Best I've had," he said. Mara had the harvest ledger open. 14% above last year, she said, across both fields. "You calculated it." I was curious. He looked at the field. "It wasn't any one thing." "No," she said, "it never is." He let that sit. The August morning was already building its heat, the kind that arrived early in Kansas and stayed until it was ready to leave. The harvested stubble caught the early light and threw it back in a way he had always found worth looking at, though he had never had anyone to say that to until now. "It never is," he said again, quieter, not repeating her so much as arriving at the same place from a different direction. She looked at him. Something moved in her face there and gone. "No," she said, "it really never is." They went back to finish the work. By the second fall, the community of Red Hollow had completed most of its revision of opinion about Mara Rourke, though revision in small communities never happens cleanly. It happens through accumulation. Ed Hannigan had come back 3 more times with accounting questions and had sent others her way. Martha Ellison had hosted a March gathering and reported afterward that Mara was surprisingly easy to talk to, which was the highest category of praise Martha distributed. Horace Pruitt had mentioned the Rourke operation favorably in enough conversations that the mention had taken on its own momentum. And then there was Alderman. Thomas Alderman ran a ranch 12 miles southeast, and he came to the Rourke property on a Thursday in July of the second summer. He came with a polite expression that Gideon read inside 30 seconds as the politeness of a man deploying it tactically. He had a feed supplier problem, costs rising, records disorganized, a suspicion of overbilling he couldn't prove from a box of receipts. Mara listened, asked 4 questions. His answers told her enough. "You've been overbilled," she said. "Probably 18 months. Your supplier added a handling fee that wasn't in your original agreement. He's been inserting it mid-invoice where it's easy to miss." Alderman stared. "How do you know that from what I described?" "Because the pattern has 2 common sources, changed usage or an added charge. Your herd count hasn't changed, your usage hasn't changed. So it's the charge." She was matter-of-fact about it. "Bring me 3 months of invoices." He brought them. She found the charge in 20 minutes. A rural delivery supplement, first appearing 14 months ago in the 3rd line of the fees section, slightly smaller type than the surrounding items. She wrote down his total overpayment and the exact language he should use when he went to address it. He looked at what she'd found and was quiet for a long moment. You could have charged for that, he said. I know, she said. Why didn't you? The problem was interesting, she said. And you're Gideon's neighbor. And when you recover what you were overbilled, you'll remember where the information came from. That's worth more than a fee. Alderman looked at Gideon, who was leaning against the kitchen doorframe with his arms folded. Gideon looked back with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by his wife approximately 8 months ago. Alderman left recalibrating. He came back 2 weeks later to report that he'd recovered 14 months of overcharges. He also brought a cured ham, which he handed to Gideon at the door without explanation, and Gideon accepted it without requiring one. It was the currency that moved quietly in ranching communities. Not spectacular, solid, like properly seated flashing. The thing Gideon noticed through the second summer and into the fall was that people had started coming to the property differently. Before they came for him for cattle knowledge, weather pattern knowledge, 11 years of accumulated land sense. They still came for that, but now they came for Mara too. And increasingly, for both together, in the understanding that certain problems needed the land knowledge and the pattern knowledge, and that both now lived at the same address. He examined this feeling carefully when he found it, because he wanted to be honest with himself about what it was. It wasn't jealousy her competence had been building something that was also his. It wasn't possessiveness. It was something closer to a satisfaction he hadn't anticipated. The specific pleasure of watching something become more than you'd made it, because you'd had the sense to recognize what you couldn't do alone. He told her that imperfectly one evening in September. You know what you're building, he said. She looked up from the accounts. I'm reviewing your cattle purchase records, not the accounts. What's happening with the neighbors? What you're becoming here? She set the pen down. What am I becoming? Somebody people come to, he said. Somebody they trust. I've been here 11 years. Built that slowly. You've built a version of it in one. That's because of you, she said. If I'd arrived somewhere with no standing to begin with, it would have taken longer. You would have managed, maybe, but I didn't arrive somewhere else. I arrived here. She met his eyes. That's not nothing, Gideon. He held her gaze. This was one of the irreducible things about Mara. She refused credit she thought was misallocated, not from modesty, but from the same precision she brought to everything. She wanted the accounting accurate. We're going around in circles, he said. Yes, she said, because you built something worth arriving to, and I arrived with something worth building on. There's no way to separate those into individual credits. They compound. She picked up the pen. That's how it's supposed to work. He looked at the table for a moment. Your father taught you that? He taught me that two people with different skills working together can produce something neither could produce alone. A pause. He was talking about carpentry. I think he was talking about more than carpentry. The anniversary arrived on a Tuesday, 1 year since the train from Missouri. 1 year since the platform and the carpet bag and the ceiling and the woman who'd asked whether the kitchen was standing. She set a cup of coffee in front of him at breakfast and sat down and said, without preamble, 1 year today. Yes, he said. I've been thinking about something. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The chimney fire, your warning letter. I've been thinking about what would have happened if it had reached me before I left. He hadn't gone there. He'd been so fixed on the fact of the arrival that the alternate version had never fully formed. You would have delayed, he said. Probably. Or reconsidered. Not because of the chimney I would have known rationally that it wasn't a fundamental problem. But the letter would have given me a reason to hesitate, and when I hesitate, I tend to find more reasons to hesitate. She was quiet for a moment. I might have talked myself out of it. He sat with that. The delayed letter, she said, might be the best thing that happened to us. He thought about the March morning, 3 a.m, ash on his hands, composing the most careful, embarrassed letter of his life. The postwriter who'd taken it too late, whatever combination of timing and chance had sent Mara Bellamy of Caldwell, Missouri onto that train before the warning could find her. You said once you didn't know what made you write the letter, she continued, that you'd told yourself you were done with trying again. I remember. I've wondered the same thing about myself. I had a complete version of a life alone. I was good at it. My reasons were sensible. She looked at him. I still don't entirely know what made me answer your advertisement. What was it, as best you can tell? She thought about it with genuine consideration. Yours was the only one that mentioned the East Field, she said. You said you had fallow acreage you hadn't been able to bring back into production. That you were looking for someone who understood the value of unused potential. A slight pause. Most advertisements described what the ranch already was. Yours described what it could be. He stared at her. I wrote that because I didn't want to misrepresent the situation. I know, she said. That's why it worked. He sat with that for a long moment. The thing he'd been embarrassed about, the incomplete, fallow, unfinished quality of what he had to offer, had been precisely the thing that made the difference. The honesty offered as an apology, received as information. Mara, he said. He stopped, started again. Before you came, this ranch was solvent, doing what it needed to do. I was proud of what I'd built, and I knew how to sustain it. He looked at the table. I had also made the ranch the ceiling of what I thought was possible. I'd stopped imagining anything larger, because imagining larger required believing something was going to keep growing with me. And I'd stopped believing that. He paused. You didn't just make the ranch better. You made me better at it, at knowing what it could be. And at the other parts, too. She was very still. I'm not good at saying this kind of thing, he said. You've been watching me not be good at it for a year. You're doing fine, she said quietly. What I'm trying to say is that I understand what you chose a year ago. When you didn't have enough information to choose responsibly, and you chose anyway. I understand the weight of that, and I am grateful, Mara. In a way I don't have a proportionate word for. The kitchen held the silence for a moment. Then she said, I want to tell you something I haven't said directly because I don't say things until I'm sure. All right, I'm sure of this, she said. I want to be here. Not because it's working, it is, and that matters. But that's not the reason. I want to be here because when I'm here, I am more completely myself than I have ever been anywhere else, including the places I chose for myself. She held his gaze. That's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing. He looked at her across the table and let what she'd said be what it was, without trying to manage it or reduce it to something more comfortable. Good, he said. She almost smiled. Good, she agreed. They finished their coffee. The morning came through the kitchen window without asking anything of it. It was a few hours later, Gideon leaning on the garden fence watching her work the September beds, that he brought it back up. The chimney fire, he said. You said it might be the best thing that happened to us. I've been thinking about that. She looked up from the carrot row. I think you're right, he said, but not only because the letter missed you. He looked at the fence, at the stakes and the dried bean vines from the summer, the 4 days of the repair that was when I knew. Knew what? That this was going to work. Not because the repair went well. Because of how it went. He met her eyes. You appeared the next morning in work clothes and asked what needed holding. You looked at the problem, organized it, worked through it without once suggesting it was mine to handle and yours to wait through. He paused. I'd been watching for the accommodation request. The thing someone asks for when the frontier becomes more than they expected. That's what happened before, and you never asked for it. That's because I didn't need accommodation, she said. I needed a problem to solve. I know that now, he said. I only knew then that you were working as hard as I was and asking for nothing to be softened. And I thought she might stay. She actually might. She looked at him across the garden fence. September light coming in low and honest, the way it did in the second half of the year. I was watching you too, she said. I know. I needed to know whether you were going to keep carrying everything alone out of habit. I've known men who say they want a partner and mean they want someone who asks permission to be useful. She said it without heat. You took the seed recommendation. You stopped reaching for things I was already carrying. She looked at him directly. You listened. That was the part that mattered. He thought about the carpet bag at the platform. 30 seconds into the year. The first small thing. Your father, he said. He taught you about corner joints. What else? He hadn't asked this before. He wasn't entirely sure why he was asking now, except that it felt like something with a right moment, and the moment had arrived. She thought about it. He said the joints are where everything fails or holds, she said. A board is just wood. The joint is where you find out what the builder knew and whether they were willing to do it right when nobody was watching. He nodded slowly. I think about that, about what I was building alone. The pieces were sound. The joints? He stopped. I'd been working them alone long enough that I'd stopped checking them properly. Is that why Lenora left? She said. Not cautiously. She never did anything cautiously when she thought directness was more honest. Not only because she was wrong for the life, but because the joints had gone unchecked? He thought about it with the honesty it deserved. Partly, he said. And partly because some joints need two people to set. You can't hold the board and drive the fastener at the same time. Someone has to hold and someone has to drive, and they have to agree on which is which, she said. Or nothing goes straight, he said. She looked at the house, the roof line, the porch, the chimney that sat sealed and correct above everything else. We agree on most things, she said. We argue about the rest. And then we agree. Eventually, he said, usually. She picked up her tools. He stayed at the fence a moment longer, looking at what the garden had become, not the perfunctory rectangle of the years before, but something organized around function, around what actually got eaten, around the knowledge of someone who understood the difference between planting for appearance and planting for result. He thought about the East Field, about the letter, written in embarrassment at 3 a.m, about the woman who had answered an advertisement because it mentioned fallow acreage and unused potential, about the way honesty, offered as apology, had somehow become the foundation of the only thing he'd built that had gotten better instead of just older. He went inside. She was at the table with the spring accounts when he came in. It was the following May. Now the third spring, the kind of morning that had stopped surprising him with its clarity and had simply become the texture of the life. The East Field was planted. The West Field's germination had been checked. Clem was in the barn. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her at the table. The lamp wasn't needed. Maylight came through the east window and did the job generously. She had her tea, which had gone cooler than she preferred, because the accounts had her attention, and her pen was moving in the particular rhythm it had when she was building toward something rather than recording what already existed. She looked up. Well, south fence is holding. East field drainage looks right from the boundary. Good. She looked back at the page, then without looking up, Gideon. Yes. Stop looking at me like that. Like what? She looked up. Like you're trying to memorize something before it disappears. He was quiet. It's been 2 years, she said, not unkindly. I know, he said. It's habit. I know it is. She held his gaze. But I'm not disappearing. I want you to actually know that, not just believe it when you're not watching the North Road. He had known she'd noticed the road. He'd known for a long time. I'm getting there, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on his. Briefly, the same matter-of-fact contact she sometimes made, not a gesture so much as a fact of proximity, of sharing the same air and the same work and the same life. The chimney fire, he said. She looked up. You said it might be the best thing that happened to us, he said. I've been sitting with that for a year. And it wasn't the best thing, he said. She waited. The best thing, he said, was that you didn't turn around when I gave you the reason to. She held his gaze across the kitchen. Maylight lay across the table between them. Outside, the East Field was doing what it did in its third season, growing in the patient, indifferent way of things that have been properly prepared and then trusted to do what they're built to do. You gave me an honest reason, she said, not a reason to leave, a reason to see what I was walking into, a pause. Honest reasons have never been the kind that stop me. He sat down. He pulled the accounts toward him and looked at the numbers, the spring numbers, the third-year numbers, the accumulated and unambiguous evidence of an operation that had found its full shape, the East Field projections, the resistant seed performance across 2 full seasons, the feed cost reductions carried forward, the drainage negotiation with aldermen that had protected the East Field's long-term yield, the effect of 2 years of decisions made by 2 people who had brought different things and learned imperfectly and specifically how to compound them. He set the accounts down. Outside, Kansas was doing what it always did, neither dramatic nor gentle, simply real, the realness of a place that doesn't soften itself for anyone, and that rewards, in the end, only those who stay long enough to learn its terms. The house stood on its foundation, the chimney sealed, the ceiling sound, the garden planted, the east field in its third season, the south fence holding, and the life inside it not smooth, not without argument, not without the occasional morning when the old habits surfaced and had to be recognized for what they were and set aside the life inside it was something neither of them had built alone, and neither of them could have. That was the thing about joints, Gideon thought. The board is just wood. The joint is where you find out what the builder was willing to do right. They had been willing, they had done it right, and it was holding.